Well, I don't know exactly why this is, but and I'm sure many of you share this with me, but I love underdog stories. Isn't that just wonderful? And you know, these stories often happen in the context of sport. Sometimes they're actually real stories. Other times they're made up fictitious stories. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Cinderella Man. But this is a boxing story. There's a lot of boxing underdog stories. But this is the story of James Braddock, who was on his way up in the 1920s in kind of boxing lore, and then he hurt his hand. And so because of this kind of serious hand injury, he couldn't box anymore. And then the Depression hits, and he's got a family with, I think it's 3 young children, and he's struggling just to feed these kids. And it's just kind of this sense of helplessness because the way in which he earns his living he can't do anymore because of his hand injury. And he's just struggling, trying to figure out what to do. But then he finally gets an opportunity to get back in the ring. His hand is healed, and they, of course, I'll give him a shot. But no one gives him a chance, right? But given the fact that it's an underdog story, you kind of know where it's going to go, right? That in the end, of course, he overcomes the odds. And that's great. And so this movie is just a part of a vast collection of stories that we have along these lines, built around a hero who overcomes tremendous obstacles to accomplish great ends. And of course, Rocky is one of those. I've mentioned the Rocky story before since I am from Philadelphia, but it's one of those stories that's hard to forget because the new sequel keeps coming out every few years. And the amazing part about that is the first one came out when I was in middle school. And so the fact that there's still one out, and they called the last one, of course, which was Creed, still has Rocky in it, but thankfully they decided not to have him fight anymore, which is really good. But who could forget this movie where you have this no-name fighter from the streets of Philadelphia who's going to go against the world champion boxer. And so several of my friends, after we watched that movie, started drinking raw eggs. That was our inspiration. And so if you don't get that reference, you got to watch the movie. But of course, it's not just in terms of boxing. We have other kinds of underdog stories. Football is another venue. And some of you may have seen the movie Rudy. Rudy is a favorite of some, where you have this kind of undersized, very athletically challenged young man, but he has a dream that he wants to play for Notre Dame. And he's willing to go to great lengths to make that dream a reality. And so it's one of those kinds of, continue to pursue it until you get it. Then, of course, you have, it doesn't even have to relate to humans. We have this story in this movie Seabiscuit about this rather smallish, undersized racehorse who goes up against War Admiral, the greatest racehorse of his day. And here's a horse who seemingly has no chance or no shot whatsoever. I mean, even his name is inferior, right? I mean, who wants to go up against a horse called War Admiral when your name is Seabiscuit? I mean, talk about giving a horse an inferiority complex. That's just sad. I mean, who thought of that? Seabiscuit. What's up with that? And then, of course, there's the cult classic Napoleon Dynamite. The story of this high school geek who helps his friend Pedro to become class president. I mean, in the end, geeks ultimately win, which is just, it's a great story. So there's just something about these kinds of stories. I don't know exactly what it is, but something about them that touches us emotionally. Why is it that we cheer for the underdog? And traditionally, social psychologists have seen that people actually tend to associate with winners. They like to be part of somebody who is a winner. But there's a professor of psychology at Richmond called Dr. Scott Allison. He studied what's called the underdog effect. And here's what he says. He says, our research suggests that people love underdogs and will provide emotional and behavioral support for them in many circumstances. He goes on to say, witness all the books and movies devoted to the lovable underdogs. Cinderella, The Little Engine That Could, remember that we start with that really early on in our lives. Rocky, The Karate Kid, Erin Brockovich. He says, rooting for the underdog is deeply ingrained in us culturally and psychologically. And it just makes me think, why is that? Why is it that we kind of love the underdog stories? And it made me think, could it be that it's related to our own insecurities? That deep down, most of us feel, in some sense, inadequate. We kind of feel like losers. And so underdog stories kind of tap in to our deepest hopes. They speak to everyone who has never been the smartest or the prettiest or the strongest or the most athletically inclined. And it says through hard work, through determination, through guts and heart, you can overcome all of those kinds of lacks and what seem to be insurmountable odds. That even if you weren't born as the greatest gifted person on the planet, that you could still make something of yourself. You can still achieve something great. And so these stories remind us that life isn't fated. That there is no simple equation that predetermines the outcome of anything. And that in a truly glorious way, life is unpredictable. And so these stories kind of motivate us to achieve something that we never dreamed possible. And they promise us that the impossible can actually become possible. To never give up, to always press on, to just keep trying. And then eventually something might wonderful happen. That if we push back against those perceived limits, who knows what we can achieve. So underdog stories kind of help us reorient our world and to recognize the new possibilities for ourselves. If they could achieve what they did in their kind of realm of battle, what could I possibly achieve in my own little world? What kind of obstacles might I overcome? And so it gives us hope. And so this morning, as we continue the story of Jesus and the birth narrative in the Gospel of Luke, we're confronted here with an underdog story. Indeed, this birth narrative is surrounded by absurdity. So last week, you might remember that we talked about this childless couple, very old and advanced in years, who have never been able to have children because Elizabeth is barren. And one can imagine the years of pain and heartache that they suffered through trying to have a child and recognizing this dream might never come. And then an angel appears to Zechariah and utters this prophecy that the impossible has become possible. And this is in chapter 1, verse 13. But the angel said, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. You will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord." And so Zechariah can't believe what he's just heard. After all these years and all those prayers, you're telling me that now finally it's going to happen? How can it be that an old man and woman should have such joy? And can you imagine that scene when Zechariah comes home and he tells Elizabeth about this prophecy, and she's like, are you off your meds or what? He says, no, let's try one last time. And then prophecy comes about. Yet such miracles are kind of merely setting the stage for far more absurdity to come. You see, Mary is kind of one of the ultimate underdog stories as we think about this young lady. Now let's ignore for a minute the absurdity of God becoming man. We'll just kind of set that one aside, of the divine taking on flesh, of the holy entering into the world of the profane. We'll just kind of set that part aside for just a minute. And let's talk about this. Because if you or I think, had been planning, how would you have the Son of God come into the world, and you're in charge of making that happen, I think that we would have had him born into a place of great prominence and a family of significance and influence. And we would probably have all the trappings of royalty and power. We'd make sure all the news crews are there. We'd make sure that everyone is appropriately impressed and that they valued and respected this child and they knew exactly who he was. And so, again, in the first century, we'd probably have him be born in Rome to royalty. And we'd make sure that everybody knew. But God, in his wisdom, chooses the ultimate underdog. You see, Mary has nothing in the way of credentials, especially in terms of the kinds of things that they would have esteemed back then. In fact, every category that people would have looked to as a marker of significance, Mary had none of these in any way, shape, or form. So, number one, Mary is a woman in a patriarchal world. And so, in her society, her worth and her value is measured by her ability to bear children for her husband. Well, she's still a virgin, so she hasn't been able to prove her worth yet. Now, number two, she is but a child. Now, back in those days, of course, we know that she was betrothed to Joseph, and betrothal was typically, a marriage, I should say, was a two-step process, that you would be betrothed, and then there would be a year-long kind of process where the husband would be preparing the home and so forth. And so usually about a year later, the marriage ceremony would take place. And betrothal was typically for young girls at this time about 12 or 13. That would be often the age at which you would get betrothed. So Mary, we would assume, is a very young person at this point. And she is a Jew. You see, in the world back then, it was filled with many gods, and the Jews were viewed as this kind of odd kind of group. They were out of place. They were this antisocial people that didn't really get together with any other group. And so they were outsiders even when they lived in the very heart of an ancient city. People didn't think very highly of the Jews, and they kind of looked on them with suspicion. She's also from Nazareth. And in the geography of the Roman Empire, Israel is on the far eastern edge of the world, in essence. Nazareth is this kind of backwater community out in the sticks. It's even far from Jerusalem, the center of Israel's power. And it's this insignificant village, primarily agricultural. And it's a very small group of people that live there. And it's a place that nobody even knows about unless you're from that area. And she's poor. We know this because when they come and bring the sacrifice that is required after you have a child, the required sacrifice typically would be some kind of lamb. But if you're too poor, you can offer 2 pigeons, which is what they bring. And so we know that they're not well off. They have little money. Yet despite all these marks against Mary, Mary is chosen. She is the one that God picks out in this most unlikely among the most unlikely of people to be the one to bring about his purpose. And the text leads us to not see anything that is significant about Mary. He doesn't pick her out because she's Mary and that she is important. But God's choice makes her special. She becomes special because he chooses her. And so the angel comes to this woman of no account, and he opens with these words in Luke chapter 1, verse 28. Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you. Now this word greetings could also be translated rejoice. You see, the angel is bringing Mary a word of joy. She will give birth to a son, Son of the Most High. Now, just as a side note here, we need to recognize that at this point when Mary is getting this prophecy, that she would not have the ability to understand what the meaning of that phrase would be like we do. She's not thinking, oh, so this is finally that pre-existent Son of God that you're going to send down to save us from our sins. The title, as she would have heard it, would have been understood more along the lines of simply Messiah. That you were going to be the mother of the Messiah, who was thought of course, to be an earthly king. So she, as a Jew, can't think in terms of second person of the Trinity, since there is no Trinity for Jews. But the angel then is going to give her a sign that the impossible has become possible. After he predicts that she will give birth to a child, she said, yeah, how do I know this is true? And he says, well, let me show you that God is doing things that you never thought could happen. And so she talks about Elizabeth and the fact that she is now, even though she is well advanced in years, which was the politically correct way of saying old, that she is pregnant. And so after the encounter with the angel, Mary rushes off to see Elizabeth, just to check that out and make sure that was true. And it is there as she enters into the house of Elizabeth that we find this kind of tremendous song of praise that we call the Magnificat. Within this great song, we find Mary rejoicing at what God has done. But it's not just for her on her own behalf, but it represents all of humanity, how God has acted for people. And embedded in this hymn of praise, we find one of Luke's key themes. It begins at the very beginning of the story and it's carried through the entire gospel. It's the theme of reversal. It tells God's story of valuing things the world itself rejects. God's love of the underdog. And so let's read a part of this song and listen for that element, beginning in verse 46. And Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy," listen to this, "is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in their thoughts and the thoughts of their hearts, and he has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and he has sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever." You see, God takes all the external markers that we so often use to judge and evaluate a person's worth, and he turns them on their heads. He is the God who brings down the powerful and the mighty and the haughty, and he lifts up the powerless and the humble. He is the God of the underdog. He is the Lord of the loser. And so when Jesus comes into our world, is it surprising at all that these are exactly the kind of people that he goes and he ministers to? He's passionately pursuing the outcasts and the prostitutes, the tax collectors and the sinners, the poor and the downtrodden. And though the religious leaders of his day intentionally tried to avoid those exact kind of people, Jesus never gave up on them. And he never gives up on us. You see, for all those who have struggled in their life, who felt oppressed and beaten down, all those who've never had the attributes that the world might value, to all those who know what it feels like to be empty and powerless and at times lost, the Advent is a reminder of joy. It's a proclamation of joy. For this child turns the value system of the world upside down. For Jesus, the impossible becomes possible. And through the story of Mary, we see God and how he uses people that we would least expect in ways that we could never anticipate. And God is still at work today in the most unlikely of places. And I think that's the reminder we need to hear this morning. You know, as a minister, I've been privileged over the years to kind of meet some remarkable people and especially hear some remarkable underdog stories. And one of the men I think about is a guy from Franklin. He grew up in Franklin, going to church, learning right from wrong, and his father actually was the preacher. But from the time he took his first drink at 9 years old, he was hooked. And he figured out that he was an alcoholic. He didn't know it at the time. By 17, he was shooting up dope and he was smoking weed, and his own sense of failure as a Christian was reinforced by others who then said, you know, you're an embarrassment to your family, because he was going down so much to confess. And so at that moment, he just kind of wrote off the church in his life and said, you know, I guess God's done with me as well, and he just left. By age 30, he had lost a marriage and a couple of businesses. And then when he was arrested for DUI and possession of drugs, he ended up trying AA for a little bit, and that didn't work so well. But things kept getting worse, and finally he became completely desperate, so he tried AA one more time, and he began to follow the 12-step process and began to recognize God as his higher power and to surrender his life once again to the one he turned his back on. And so he then met a wonderful Christian woman who kind of reclaimed him to the faith and brought him back to the community of faith, and he was finally able to learn to receive grace, amazing grace. And then he began to look around and see what he could do, and he started working with some of the teams at the Franklin football squad and helped them along the way. He became kind of an assistant over there. And then he had this idea of beginning a ministry at church, and kind of an AA ministry himself, a recovery ministry for those who had followed a similar path. And then he tells this story, he says he was up in a tree stand hunting deer one day when all of a sudden God gave him a vision for a nonprofit ministry, which he has started and is running now over a decades-long mentoring ministry to the inner city youth of Franklin, and has become its own nonprofit with a lot of volunteers, and I don't know how many hundreds of kids he's impacted since that point in time. And my point is, as I think about that story, is that if you had seen that man in the middle of his crisis, you would have probably written him off and thought, well, here was a man who had made some bad choices, and now he was simply getting what he deserved. Here was a man who was beyond hope. Here was a man who would never amount to anything. Here was a man who was truly a loser. But God didn't see him that way. And God doesn't see any of us that way. We're all just works in progress. God isn't done with any of us. And so no matter how hopeless things might seem at times, whether in your own life or in the life of those around you, it doesn't have to be the end of the story, because God is still writing. God is the champion of the underdog. He's the one who takes what we deem as impossible and he makes it possible. And I would challenge us to see both ourselves and others through this same lens. Don't count anybody out, even yourself. Because God is wanting to do great things with our lives, if only we will let him. So I invite the praise team to come up as we close out. I think I've been there a number of times where I've looked at people and thought, why bother with them? They're too far gone. But this morning I want us to remember the story of a young Jewish woman with no status and no position in this out-of-the-way backwater place. She had no marks of privilege, yet from such humble beginnings, God brought forth the Savior of the world. And that's God's ultimate underdog story.